Hi, this is Gail Sokol. On today's show, we're going to be talking about fermentation.
Welcome to Baking Radio. Learn the art and science of baking with author, educator, and award-winning chef, Gail Sokol. Whether you've been baking your whole life or you're brand new to the world of baking and you're looking to build your confidence and learn new skills in the kitchen, you're in the right place. This is Baking Radio.
So today we're going to talk about a subject known as fermentation. And fermentation is a way to leaven certain baked goods, yeasted baked goods. Fermentation's super important and it happens all the time. We don't even realize it, that it's a part of our lives. But if you take sugar and there's any yeast around, things happen. The yeast will eat sugar and they will give two waste products off, carbon dioxide, bubbles or gas, and alcohol. Certain industries like the beer and wine industry are super interested in the alcohol part of this basic reaction, but we as bakers, we are interested in the carbon dioxide because we want this carbon dioxide, these little bubbles of gas, to get stuck in our baked goods. So how do they get stuck in baked goods? Let's talk about this before we even start talking about what forms yeast can take and other types of fermentation. So in wheat flour, and this is specific to wheat flours, there are two proteins. One is gliadin and the other is glutenin. And when they're combined with water, they form this protein matrix known as gluten. And a lot of people cannot eat gluten because they have celiac disease. And therefore, they have to be relegated to eating baked goods that may not taste as wonderful as the baked goods that have gluten in them, although gluten-free products can be very, very good. In yeast flour, there are two proteins known as gliadin and glutenin. And when these proteins come in contact with water and water's mixed into them, they form this protein matrix, this stretchy, almost like a spider webby material known as gluten. And gluten is very important in helping baked goods to rise. It also gives baked goods structure and strength. So there's a lot of gluten development in things like bagels, pizza dough, things that are chewy, and a lot of yeasted breads have this texture. We don't use a lot of fermentation and yeast in things like a pie crust or cookies. Those use more chemical leaveners, so they don't use the fermentation process. So fermentation is basically used in yeast doughs, like a white bread, a whole wheat bread, a challah bread, things like that, a brioche bread, croissants, things like that. Even a Danish pastry or a sweet coffee cake. Cinnamon rolls, those all use yeast and the process of fermentation to get carbon dioxide gas bubbles created, and they must get stuck in this protein matrix. So this is what brings it back. Why do we need gluten? So the carbon dioxide that's formed through the fermentation process, if we don't catch these little guys, these little carbon dioxide gas bubbles, our baked goods aren't going to rise. They're going to be like a football. They're going to taste dense and heavy. And we're not going to like bread that we do. We love bread in this country. And for that matter, throughout the world, bread is a staple for almost every culture in different forms. And most of them use yeast, not all of them, but most. So this incredible reaction where yeast eats sugar and give off carbon dioxide and alcohol, super important to the baking process, especially yeasted breads. So now we have to bring up yeast. What is yeast? Well, yeast is the main player in fermentation. Yeast is a one-celled organism. it needs warmth and other environmental comforts that we as humans also need. So it needs to be about 90 to 110 degrees. It needs to be nice and warm and comfy. It needs moisture to rehydrate if it's dried, and we tend to buy it in the dry form. And it also needs food, and it loves sugar. And yeast will gobble up sugar and create these two waste products. Billions and billions and billions of carbon dioxide gas bubbles and alcohol as well. Now, in a baked good like yeasted bread, the alcohol will just evaporate. So you're not going to, taste an Italian bread that tastes boozy or anything, because that's not going to happen. The alcohol will just cook right off and evaporate. But the texture, the crumb, how open is that bread structure is all related to the fermentation process and the mixing process of this yeasted bread. So let's talk about the different types of yeast. First of all, you can buy yeast in the grocery store. It should be stored, or should be actually sold in the grocery store in the refrigerated section. Sometimes it is not. I have come across many grocery stores that keep it in the baking aisle, which is fine as long as it's cool and dry there, but it's best kept in a cold environment. So the first type you can get is known as active dry yeast, and it usually comes in little packets of 3. There's many brands. You can even buy it in a little bottle if you do a lot of baking, a lot of yeast spread baking. Now, active dry yeast is a slightly larger granule of yeast. It is grown in the laboratory, and the species of yeast, there's not going to be a quiz at the end of this program, but the species of yeast that are used are known as Saccharomyces cerevisiae. That's the type of yeast that you and I would purchase in the grocery store to make yeasted breads. And active dry yeast needs to be proofed. So that means you have to mix it with a liquid like water, like a warm liquid, like we said, 90 to 110 degrees. And it needs a little pinch of sugar, a little honey, a little something to get it to wake up. Because if it's in a package and it's been dehydrated, you really need to make sure that it's alive. And there are so many trillions of particles of yeast in a little package. Usually they come in 3 packages of 1/4 ounce each, and each 1/4 ounce is about 2 1/4 teaspoons. Okay, so if a recipe says you need 1 packet of yeast, you'd be using approximately 2 1/4 teaspoons or 1/4 of an ounce. So if a recipe says to proof the yeast, it will tell you to add a little water, a little bit of sugar or honey. You'll whisk that together and you'll let it sit for maybe 5 or 10 minutes. This is where the yeast decide to wake up, rehydrate, and start eating breakfast. And once they do, you're going to start seeing fermentation right before your eyes. You're going to see not fermentation per se, but the effects of fermentation. You're going to see carbon dioxide forming. You're going to see bubbles foaming, almost like for a head of a freshly poured beer. That's what you're going to see. It's going to get nice and foamy. And that foam is your proof that your yeast is nice and alive, and you can continue with your recipe. Now, I've had some yeast that has kicked the bucket, and it is dead. It actually will not, cannot be revived. It's maybe too old. It's past its expiration point, or for some reason was not a good batch. And sometimes you get a lemon of a batch. And if it does nothing, you have to throw it out. Because if you don't throw it out and you start adding your other ingredients, you're going to have flat bread. And it's not going to rise. It's not going to have a great whole structure. It's not going to have a great texture. Now, active dry yeast, or any yeast that comes in the packages, some of it will die. All right, you can't help it. Some of it will die. Even as you rehydrate it, not all of it will be super alive. So you're not getting trillions and trillions of yeast particles, sometimes, or granules. Sometimes some of them will die in the dehydration process. And that happens. The second type of yeast that you can purchase is instant or fast rising yeast. This is a smaller granule. It really is much easier to use than active dry. It does not need any proofing. And if you looked at the difference between active dry yeast granules and instant or fast rising yeast granules, you would see there's a size difference. Active dry is a larger granule, and instant or fast rising are very, very tiny. They're smaller. And if you head on over to bakingradio.com, I have some video that you can actually see the difference. I put them in little containers when I make yeast bread, and you can actually see, and I explain this. Now, I like to call the instant or fast rising yeast, when I explain this to my students, I call it the Arnold Schwarzenegger yeast, because it's so small and so easily dissolved, and yet it packs more of a punch. Each yeast granule can create more carbon dioxide than active dry, larger granules. Super powerful yeast, so you don't need as much of it. You can actually cut down on the amount of yeast you use, and that's why it's known as fast rising. Some people want to use the exact same amount that if a recipe calls for 1 package of active dry, they'll substitute instant or active or fast rising the same amount, 1 package for 1 package. And you can do that. You will not need to allow your dough to ferment that long, because the yeast is so powerful, it's just going to go super quickly. But usually you want to cut down on the amount by about 1/3. Now, fast rising yeast has a really interesting property. You don't need to dissolve it in water, and you don't need to see if it's alive. You can just mix it in with your flour, because like I said before, it's a tiny little granule. It's easily mixed in with other ingredients. The only thing is with yeast, you want to make sure you don't put it directly in with sugar or salt, with nothing else around it. So if you are using instant or fast rising yeast, and the recipe says you can mix it right into your other ingredients, make sure that there's flour in there first in the bowl. Then you can add your yeast and then your sugar and salt. Sugar and salt have a way of pulling the liquid out of yeast. Even though it's dehydrated and it's dried out, there's still a microscopic amount of water in it, and it can suck it dry and kill it and actually destroy that yeast before you even start baking with it. And you need your yeast to be alive. If they're not alive, you can't bake with them. That's why we had to proof our active dry to make sure it was alive. So our instant or fast rising, we're going to put it in with our other ingredients, and you just mix them together, and it's fabulous. I think I use all instant or fast rising yeast for all my baking now. In my new book, Baking with Success, I have a lot of yeasted bread recipes, both sweetened and savory, and they all use instant or fast rising yeast. It's just a lot easier for the baker and a lot more convenient. Now let's talk about something known as wild yeast. So there's wild versus laboratory yeast. Now the laboratory yeast I talked about is the type you can buy in the grocery store, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and it's in those packages of 3 from a couple of brands, and you can buy them in a bottle as well. Another way that you can make a starter is taking something as simple as grapes or even apples. You can make starters from potato, many different fruits and vegetables that have this natural yeast on them. And there are natural wild yeasts, really, because they're not from the laboratory, and they will grow. And you can create starters, these bubbly, living, fermented concoctions, and you can bake with them. And these are known as pre-ferments. They are almost like a dough, but they're bubbly and really alive. It sounds like a science fiction movie, but it's not. And you can actually take a couple cupfuls of these starters and start a dough with them. So you're actually fermenting something ahead of time. That's why it's called a pre-ferment. And then you can Save some of that pre-ferment or that sourdough starter and keep it in your refrigerator or keep it at room temperature and keep feeding it and making that yeast happy enough that it will thrive and multiply and continue the fermentation process until the next time you want to bake with it. And I have 3 sourdough starters in my refrigerator as we speak, and it makes fabulous bread. I believe each and every time I bake, it gets better and better. One of my starters is about 22 years old and was started, so long ago. And I actually won an award for the bread made with this starter. And it was a rosemary olive oil bread. And all these other chefs were up all night long making breads. And I had made my bread because I knew what I wanted to make, and it was just perfect. It came out so great. So they were asking me what my secret was. But my sourdough starter was the secret. So today we learned about fermentation and the process where yeast eat sugar and give off 2 waste products, carbon dioxide gas and alcohol, and how that carbon dioxide gets stuck in our protein matrix and helps our baked goods to rise and gives them a lightness and a certain texture. And a mouthfeel and a crumb, and they make beautiful breads. Next week, we're going to be actually making a simple yeast bread using this fermentation and this process that we just learned about today. If you have any questions, head on over to bakingradio.com and leave me a message. I would love to answer any of your questions on fermentation that you might have. And on next week's show, we're going to be discussing how to make a simple yeast bread.